The highway stretched flat and endless under the late afternoon sun, asphalt humming beneath passing tires, when red and blue lights exploded in the rearview mirror of a silver sedan cruising just under 70 miles per hour. The woman behind the wheel eased her foot off the gas without panic, signaled, and guided the car onto the shoulder with practiced calm. Two police cruisers boxed her in, one tight behind, one angled ahead, doors already opening before her engine fully stopped. She watched in silence as two white officers approached from opposite sides, hands resting near their belts, eyes already narrowed. No greeting, no explanation, just a look that said the decision had been made before a word was spoken. The wind off the highway tugged at her open window as the first officer leaned in, voice sharp, impatient, already accusatory. "Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much." The officer didn't ask if she knew why she was stopped. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't even glance at her license yet. Instead, his first sentence landed like a verdict. He said she'd been swerving. He said her eyes looked unfocused. He said he smelled alcohol. None of it was true, but truth wasn't what this stop was about. The second officer circled the back of the car slowly, deliberately, shining a flashlight even though daylight still clung to the road. The woman kept both hands visible on the steering wheel, her posture steady, her breathing measured, the kind of control earned over years of knowing that any sudden move could be rewritten as a threat. When she spoke, her voice was even, respectful, asking a simple question about the reason for the stop. The response came back colder. "Step out of the vehicle." Not a request, a command. The first officer lifted a small device into view and gave a humorless smile, the kind that carried more assumption than procedure. He told her to admit she'd been drinking. He said it would go easier if she just told the truth now. Cars sped past them at 75 miles per hour, drivers barely glancing at the scene, unaware that something familiar and ugly was unfolding on the shoulder. The woman stepped out slowly, as instructed, closing the door behind her with care. She stood straight, feet planted on the gravel, eyes forward, refusing to give them the reaction they seemed to want. Her calm irritated them. One officer mistook it for defiance, the other for guilt. He repeated the accusation louder this time, as if volume could make it real. He talked about tests, about cuffs, about how people like her always had an excuse. The words hung there, heavy and unmistakable. She felt the old memory stir, the echo of other stops, other roads, other uniforms, different years, but the same tone. She did not raise her voice. She did not argue. She asked, once more, for clarification and for their names. That was when the first officer scoffed and leaned closer, invading her space, telling her she should worry less about names and more about what was about to happen next. For the first time since the lights came on, she shifted her gaze and met his eyes directly. Her expression didn't harden. It didn't soften either. It settled. And when she spoke again, it wasn't loud or dramatic. It was measured, deliberate, and carried a warning they were too certain to hear. She told them, quietly, that before they went any further, they might want to check who they were stopping. The highway noise swallowed the moment, and the officers laughed it off, already convinced they were in control, unaware that this routine stop was about to expose far more than they ever intended. The laughter faded quickly, replaced by the scrape of boots on gravel as the first officer stepped closer and told her to place her hands behind her back, not because she had failed a test, but because he said he did not like her tone. The words were delivered casually, like an explanation was a courtesy rather than a requirement, and the second officer moved in without hesitation, positioning himself just off her shoulder, close enough that she could feel his presence without seeing his face. She complied, slowly, deliberately, fingers interlacing exactly as instructed, aware that any deviation could be rewritten later in a report she would not be allowed to read until it was too late. Traffic continued to roar past them, a steady reminder that the world was still moving while this small pocket of authority expanded unchecked. The first officer began a field sobriety test without asking whether she consented, instructing her to follow the tip of his pen with her eyes, then accusing her of failing when she blinked against the wind from a passing truck. When she calmly stated that she had not been drinking and requested a breath test or a supervisor, the second officer scoffed and said she was making things harder than they needed to be. He told her that people who were innocent did not argue on the side of the road, as if silence was the only acceptable form of compliance. She noticed the shift then, the subtle change from suspicion to irritation, from procedure to punishment, and she recognized it instantly because she had seen it before, not just in her own life, but from the bench, written between the lines of transcripts and body camera footage, always justified after the fact. The first officer stepped back and spoke into his radio, his voice low and deliberately vague, using phrases like uncooperative subject and possible impairment, words that carried weight without requiring proof. She stood still while he spoke, eyes forward, shoulders squared, refusing to give them the satisfaction of fear. When he finished, he told her she was being detained until further notice, then added, almost as an afterthought, that they would search her vehicle for open containers. She reminded him evenly that he did not have consent and asked what probable cause he was asserting. That was when his jaw tightened and his voice dropped, and he told her that her attitude was becoming a problem. The second officer shifted again, this time positioning himself between her and the road, cutting off her line of sight, a subtle maneuver meant to isolate, to remind her how alone she was out there. A passing driver slowed, glanced over, then sped up, unwilling to linger. The first officer opened her car door without waiting for a response and began scanning the interior with his flashlight, narrating what he saw as if already building a story, commenting on a reusable water bottle like it was suspicious, on the navigation screen like it proved she was unfamiliar with the area. She listened without reacting, each word catalogued in her mind, each assumption noted. When he found nothing, his frustration showed, and he returned to her with a tight smile that did not reach his eyes. He asked her again to admit she had been drinking, promising leniency if she stopped pretending. She told him once more, clearly, that she had not consumed alcohol and that she was invoking her right to remain silent beyond identifying herself. That sentence changed everything. The word invoking seemed to irritate him more than any denial, as if the very idea that she knew her rights was an affront. He told her that rights did not work the way she thought they did out here, that the highway was not a courtroom, that he decided what happened next. For a brief moment, the power imbalance was complete. 2 armed officers, 1 unarmed woman, the law bent into whatever shape suited them. She felt the familiar weight of history pressing in, the knowledge that this scene had played out countless times with far worse endings. She did not raise her voice. She did not plead. She repeated her request for a supervisor and stated that she was documenting everything mentally. The first officer laughed and said there would be plenty of documentation. He just did not realize yet who would be reading it. The radio crackled again, sharper this time, and the first officer turned his back slightly as he listened, nodding once before clipping it back onto his shoulder, his confidence returning in a way that suggested reinforcement was on the way. He informed her that a supervisor had been notified but made it clear that this did not mean she would be going anywhere soon, emphasizing that delays were a consequence of her choices, not theirs. The second officer took advantage of the pause to begin asking questions that were not really questions at all, probing where she was coming from, why she was traveling alone, why her registration address did not match the county they were in, each inquiry carrying the same unspoken implication that she did not belong on this stretch of road. She answered only what was legally required, stating her name when asked again, then falling silent, her stillness drawing more irritation than resistance ever could. A third cruiser appeared in the distance moments later, lights flashing as it slowed and pulled in behind the others, effectively sealing off the shoulder, transforming a traffic stop into a spectacle of authority meant to overwhelm. The arriving officer stepped out slowly, surveying the scene before approaching his colleagues first, listening as they spoke in low tones, glancing at her only briefly as if she were an object being discussed rather than a person standing within earshot. When he finally addressed her, his voice carried a rehearsed calm, asking if there had been an issue, framing it as concern while his eyes assessed her posture, her silence, her refusal to shrink. She repeated her request for a supervisor and a breath test, noting clearly that no probable cause had been articulated. He responded with a thin smile and said they were the supervisor, that the situation was under control, that cooperation would be noted, a word chosen carefully to imply consequences. The first officer then produced a set of plastic cuffs, holding them loosely, not yet applying them, but letting them catch the light just long enough to be seen. He explained that she was not under arrest, but was being temporarily restrained for officer safety, a phrase she had read dozens of times in case law, often used to justify exactly what was happening now. She felt the familiar tightening in her chest, not fear but anger held in check, the knowledge that this moment balanced on their interpretation of her demeanor. A pickup truck slowed in the right lane, its driver staring openly before honking once in what sounded like disapproval, then accelerating away, unwilling or unable to intervene. The supervisor asked her again if she had been drinking, this time more softly, as if offering an off-ramp, suggesting that honesty would make this easier for everyone involved. She met his gaze and said clearly that she had not consumed alcohol, that she was not consenting to any searches, and that she was invoking her constitutional rights. The word constitutional landed differently this time, causing a brief flicker of uncertainty that passed quickly as the first officer interjected, stating that she was being uncooperative and escalating the encounter. The supervisor nodded slowly, weighing optics against instinct, then instructed the first officer to proceed with temporary detention. As the cuffs were applied, gently but firmly, she remembered other cases, other transcripts, defendants described as combative for far less, reports written. To justify the unjustifiable, she reminded herself to note the time, the number of units present, the exact language used, every detail that would matter later. The cuffs clicked closed, not painfully, but deliberately, a sound that echoed louder in her mind than the passing traffic. The supervisor leaned in slightly and told her this would all be sorted out soon if she stayed calm, as if calm had ever been the issue. She looked past him toward the open highway, the endless ribbon of road stretching forward, and understood with absolute clarity that this moment was no longer just about a traffic stop. It was about a system testing how far it could go, unaware that the woman standing restrained on the shoulder was already preparing to hold it to account. The supervisor stepped back after the cuffs were secured, creating a small circle of distance as if the scene itself needed room to breathe, and he instructed the first officer to run her information again, slower this time, his tone shifting from command to calculation. The second officer remained planted nearby, arms crossed, eyes fixed on her face, waiting for something to break, a tremor or a plea that never came. She stood still on the gravel shoulder, wrists restrained behind her, spine straight, breathing steady, letting the silence do its work while the radio traffic murmured in fragments she could not fully hear. The first officer returned to the patrol car and began typing, his movements sharp and irritated, glancing up at her periodically as if daring the computer to confirm what he already believed. Minutes stretched, the sun lowering just enough to cast long shadows across the road, and with each passing moment the initial certainty that had fueled the stop began to thin, replaced by something closer to doubt. A state trooper cruiser slowed in the far lane, its driver taking in the scene before continuing on, and she wondered briefly whether that glance would matter later, whether it would appear anywhere beyond memory. The supervisor checked his watch and asked the first officer if dispatch had responded yet, irritation creeping into his voice as the delay became harder to justify. When the reply came back through the radio, muffled but unmistakable, the first officer froze for a split second, then straightened, his posture stiffening in a way that had nothing to do with authority, and everything to do with surprise. He asked dispatch to repeat the information, his voice suddenly careful, stripped of the casual dominance it had carried earlier. The supervisor noticed immediately and stepped closer, asking what the issue was, his eyes flicking from the officer to her and back again. The first officer hesitated, then turned the screen slightly, just enough for the supervisor to see, and whatever appeared there changed the air completely. The supervisor's jaw tightened as he read, his expression shifting from control to concern, then to something bordering on alarm. He looked at her again, really looked this time, not as a suspect or a problem, but as a variable they had failed to account for. He asked dispatch to confirm the information through a secondary channel, his voice low and urgent, and instructed the second officer to step back, a command that was obeyed instantly without comment. She felt the subtle release of pressure, not physical but psychological, the sense that the machinery grinding against her had begun to stall. The first officer exited the patrol car and approached more slowly now, no longer crowding her space, his earlier confidence replaced by a guarded neutrality. He asked her, carefully, if she would like the cuffs adjusted, framing it as a courtesy rather than an admission, and she replied evenly that she would like them removed if she was not under arrest. The supervisor held up a hand, signaling a pause, and told the officer to wait. He stepped aside and spoke quietly into his radio again, his words clipped, professional, stripped of bravado, requesting confirmation and guidance, invoking policy where minutes earlier he had dismissed it. Cars continued to pass, unaware that the narrative had shifted, that the power dynamic on the shoulder was no longer one-sided. She remained silent, letting the facts surface on their own, aware that this was the moment when instinct gave way to protocol, when the story they had been writing no longer matched the evidence on the screen. The supervisor returned and addressed her directly, his tone markedly different, asking her to confirm her identity and role, not accusatory now, but precise, careful, as if each word mattered. She answered calmly, stating her name and position without embellishment, watching as the realization settled fully across his face. He nodded once, slowly, then turned to the officers and issued quiet instructions, his authority reasserted but redirected, ordering the cuffs removed and the encounter de-escalated immediately. As the restraints were unlocked and her hands came free, the sound of plastic separating echoed like a punctuation mark at the end of a sentence they could not take back. The supervisor apologized, not expansively, not emotionally, but formally, acknowledging that the stop had escalated improperly, while the first officer stared at the ground, his earlier assumptions collapsing under the weight of verification. She rolled her shoulders once, restoring circulation, and met the supervisor's gaze with a calm that made clear this moment would not end on the shoulder of a highway. The system had revealed itself, and she intended to ensure that what happened next would be documented, examined, and answered for, not just for her, but for every name that had never triggered a pause in dispatch, every stop that had ended without witnesses or corrections, every assumption left unchallenged until now. The supervisor's apology lingered in the air only briefly before procedure took over again, and he explained that she was free to leave, that the stop was concluded, that there would be no citation, no report worth worrying about, his words attempting to compress what had happened into something small and forgettable. She listened without interrupting, her expression unreadable, then asked calmly for the badge numbers of every officer present and the incident number associated with the stop. The request caused a flicker of discomfort, quickly masked, as the supervisor nodded and provided the information, his tone careful now, aware that this encounter had crossed into territory beyond roadside discretion. As she rubbed her wrists once more, restoring feeling, the memory she had been holding at bay surfaced fully, uninvited and vivid. Years earlier, before the robe, before the bench, she had been stopped on a rural road at night, a younger woman then, alone, compliant, her hands trembling as an officer accused her of matching a description that never existed. She remembered how that stop ended with a warning and a lecture about attitude, how she drove away shaking, replaying every word, every glance, knowing there would be no accountability because there never was. That memory threaded itself through others, cases she had later presided over, defendants whose stories echoed her own, their credibility questioned, their composure misread, their silence framed as guilt. Standing there now, on the shoulder of a busy highway in daylight, she understood with sharp clarity that what had just occurred was not an anomaly, but a pattern interrupted only because the system had recognized her name. The first officer avoided her eyes as he returned to his cruiser, his movements stiff, while the second busied himself with adjusting equipment that did not need adjusting. The supervisor asked if there was anything else she needed before leaving, his voice almost deferential, and she replied evenly that she would be requesting the body camera footage, the dispatch logs, and the radio communications related to the stop, all of which would be preserved. His nod was immediate, a silent acknowledgement that the matter was no longer contained. As she walked back to her car, traffic rushing by as if nothing extraordinary had happened. She felt neither relief nor triumph, only a steady resolve settling into place. She knew the familiar impulse to minimize, to let the moment pass, to accept the apology and move on, and she knew exactly why that impulse existed, because the cost of challenging the system was always framed as higher than the cost of enduring it. She sat behind the wheel for a moment before starting the engine, taking in the scene one last time, the cruisers pulling away one by one, the shoulder returning to emptiness, the evidence of what had transpired already dissolving into routine. When she merged back onto the highway, she did not accelerate immediately, allowing the moment to close with intention rather than haste. Her thoughts shifted from memory to action, from reflection to responsibility, because she understood that this was not about personal vindication but institutional reckoning. She knew how reports were written, how language softened misconduct into misunderstanding, how the absence of injury was used to excuse the presence of bias. She also knew how records could be subpoenaed, how patterns could be established, how testimony carried weight when paired with documentation. By the time the next exit sign came into view, she had already outlined the steps she would take, the calls she would make, the questions that would be asked under oath rather than on the roadside. The officers believed the encounter had ended because she drove away, because no arrest was made, because the cuffs were removed, but she knew better. The true consequence of the stop was only beginning, not fueled by anger or spectacle, but by the quiet certainty of someone who understood the law intimately and had just watched it fail in real time. As the highway stretched ahead once more, she maintained her lane, steady and unhurried, carrying with her the weight of what had been revealed and the determination to ensure it would not be buried, not this time, not after the system had shown its hand so clearly. By the time she reached the outskirts of the city, the decision she had made on the highway had fully crystallized into action, and she pulled into a quiet parking area not to rest, but to begin documenting while the details were still sharp. She noted the time stamps from memory, the sequence of commands, the language used, the moment the tone shifted from suspicion to dominance, and then to restraint once verification intervened. She understood how memory could be attacked later, how recollection was often treated as subjective and less anchored to records, and she intended to anchor everything. She placed a call that did not require explanation or drama, speaking evenly to an assistant who knew her cadence well enough to hear the shift beneath it, instructing that a preservation request be prepared immediately for all body camera footage, dash camera recordings, dispatch audio, and computer-aided dispatch logs related to the stop, including secondary queries and repeated database checks. She requested the names of supervisors on duty, the watch commander, and the policy sections governing temporary detention, field sobriety initiation, and consent searches on highways. The response on the other end was immediate and precise, acknowledgments delivered without surprise, because this was not the first time the law had demanded to be treated as more than suggestion. She remained seated in her car as she spoke, the hum of distant traffic underscoring the normalcy of the setting against the abnormality of what had occurred, aware that the quiet now was deceptive, that processes were already moving beyond her sight. When the call ended, she sent a brief message to herself, a habit formed long ago, summarizing the core facts in neutral language, stripping emotion away so that only conduct remained. She knew how easily narratives could be reframed if they were allowed to breathe without constraint, and she would not allow that space. As she re-entered traffic, she reflected not with nostalgia, but with professional clarity. On cases where similar stops had been justified after the fact, where officers testified that they felt threatened, that the subject was evasive, that circumstances required firmness, and she recognized the same phrases forming earlier on the shoulder, the same scaffolding being erected to support a conclusion already reached. The difference now was timing and authority. Within hours, she knew, the records would be mirrored and preserved, not subject to routine deletion, not quietly categorized and forgotten. Within days, inquiries would be formal, written, unavoidable. She did not need to announce her role or issue warnings. The structure of the law would do that for her, because it was designed to function best when used deliberately rather than defensively. As evening approached and the lights softened, she arrived at her destination and parked, taking a final moment to steady herself before exiting the vehicle, not out of fear but out of respect for the weight of what she was initiating. She understood that scrutiny would not stop with the officers on the highway, that supervisors would be questioned, that training protocols would be examined, that patterns would be sought across stops involving drivers who shared her skin color and none of her institutional recognition. She understood as well that there would be resistance, subtle and overt, attempts to reframe the incident as resolved, to emphasize the lack of arrest as evidence of propriety, to suggest that the outcome proved the system worked. She rejected that logic entirely, because she had lived the truth beneath it, that the system only paused because it recognized her name, not because it recognized her rights. Inside, away from the road, she reviewed a preliminary draft prepared with efficiency, noting the language carefully, ensuring accuracy, ensuring restraint, ensuring that nothing could be dismissed as exaggeration. This was not about spectacle or personal grievance. It was about fidelity to the law as written and the harm caused when it was selectively applied. As night settled, she sent one final instruction to proceed, authorizing the next phase without flourish, knowing that once begun it could not be quietly undone. The highway stop had ended hours earlier, but its consequences were now formal, measured, and inevitable, moving forward through channels designed for accountability, driven not by anger, but by the disciplined certainty of someone who had seen the system from every side and refused to let its failures pass unexamined. The formal notice went out quietly at first, routed through channels that rarely drew public attention, but its impact was immediate within the department, because it did not come from an advocacy group or a media inquiry, but from a judicial office with authority to compel, review, and sanction. The request was narrow in tone and expansive in scope, seeking not only the records from a single traffic stop, but comparative data from similar stops conducted by the same officers and unit over a defined period, including demographic information, stated causes for detention, escalation markers, and outcomes. When the chief of police read it, he understood at once that this was not a misunderstanding to be smoothed over, but a process that would expose patterns if they existed, and the weight of that realization settled heavily across the command staff. Internal emails began circulating within hours, cautious and clipped, asking who had been on duty, who had authorized the stop, who had reviewed the initial report before it was closed, questions that revealed a sudden urgency to reconstruct a narrative that had already been documented elsewhere. The officers involved were notified that they were required to submit supplemental statements, and for the first time since the lights had flashed on the highway shoulder, they were asked to explain their decisions in writing rather than through assumption. As they did, the language they chose echoed the familiar phrases she had anticipated, references to demeanor, to officer safety, to discretion exercised under uncertain conditions, each line crafted to sound reasonable in isolation while avoiding the cumulative effect. Meanwhile, she sat in chambers reviewing the materials as they arrived, her posture composed, her attention precise, noting inconsistencies between radio traffic and written accounts, timing gaps between commands and justifications, the absence of articulated probable cause preceding actions that required it. She did not rush, because she understood that patience was a form of power, and that accuracy mattered more than speed. When a senior representative from the department requested an informal conversation to resolve the matter amicably, she declined politely, stating that the process was already underway and would proceed as required, a response that left no room for negotiation. Word spread quietly through the building then, not as gossip but as recognition, as those who understood the system began to connect the name on the order to the woman stopped. On the highway, realizing with dawning clarity who she was and what her role meant. The realization altered the tone of subsequent communications immediately, apologies offered in careful language, assurances of cooperation emphasized repeatedly, but the shift came too late to undo what had been set in motion. In a closed meeting days later, she addressed the scope of the inquiry directly, clarifying that it was not punitive by default, but corrective by necessity, that the purpose was not to single out individuals without cause, but to examine whether conduct aligned with constitutional standards uniformly or selectively. Her voice was calm, devoid of accusation, which only sharpened the effect of her words, because they were rooted in law rather than emotion. She reminded those present that rights did not fluctuate with context, that the highway was not exempt from constitutional protection, that discretion was not a license to default to bias. As she spoke, the officers who had once stood over her with cuffs now sat in a room where silence was required of them, listening as their own actions were reframed through statutes and precedent rather than authority. The transformation was complete and irreversible, not because she had revealed her title on the roadside, but because the system had finally been forced to confront itself in a space where power was measured differently. She concluded the session without drama, stating that findings would be issued once the review was complete and that any necessary reforms would be recommended formally, her expression steady, her tone final. Outside the room, the machinery of accountability continued to turn, slower than outrage but far more enduring, driven by documentation, testimony, and the quiet certainty that this encounter would not be dismissed as an unfortunate moment, but recognized as a deliberate test the system had failed. On the highway, they had seen a black woman alone and assumed compliance would erase consequence. In the process that followed, they learned that assumption was the most costly mistake of all. The findings were released without spectacle, bound in precise language and supported by documentation that left little room for interpretation. And when the report circulated through official channels, it carried a weight that could not be deflected by public relations or internal reassurance. It detailed the sequence of the stop minute by minute, juxtaposing radio traffic with body camera footage, noting where justifications appeared after actions, rather than before them, and identifying language that escalated the encounter absent articulated cause. It outlined how assumptions replaced observation, how authority expanded in response to calm rather than threat, and how restraint was applied under the guise of safety without the factual predicates required by law. Comparative data followed, revealing a pattern that could no longer be framed as coincidence. Stops initiated on similar roadways by the same unit, drivers disproportionately black, outcomes disproportionately escalated, the same phrases repeated across reports like a template learned and reused. The department responded first with statements of cooperation, then with silence, and finally with announcements that confirmed what the documentation had already made inevitable. The officers involved were placed on administrative leave pending further action, their authority temporarily suspended while reviews advanced through civil service procedures. Training protocols were ordered revised, not cosmetically but structurally, with mandates for documentation before escalation and supervisory approval thresholds tightened. A civilian oversight review was scheduled, not as a concession but as a requirement, and policy bulletins were issued clarifying that demeanor alone could not substitute for probable cause. Inside the department, morale shifted in complex ways, some bristling at scrutiny, others relieved that ambiguity had been stripped away, because uncertainty protected misconduct as much as it protected good faith error. She did not attend the press briefing, and she did not issue a personal statement, allowing the report to speak for itself, because the power of the record lay in its restraint. In chambers, she reviewed subsequent filings with the same care she had applied from the beginning, approving referrals where warranted, declining where evidence did not support action, ensuring that the process remained disciplined rather than reactive. When counsel for the officers requested mitigation based on intent, she noted calmly that constitutional violations were measured by effect and authority, not by claimed mindset, a principle long settled but too often ignored. The chief of police requested a meeting, and when it occurred it was formal and focused, centered on compliance timelines and monitoring, not apologies or explanations. She made clear that reforms would be evaluated by outcomes, not by announcements, and that failure to implement would invite further review. As weeks passed, the ripple effects became visible beyond the department. Neighboring agencies requesting guidance, training academies revising curricula, prosecutors reconsidering reliance on testimony that mirrored the language flagged in the report. None of this unfolded quickly enough to satisfy those who demanded immediacy, but it unfolded thoroughly, which mattered more. The officers who had stood on the shoulder with certainty learned what it meant to have their decisions examined under oath, their words parsed against recordings, their authority constrained by standards they had treated as optional. There were no dramatic confrontations, no raised voices, no public shaming, only consequences applied through the mechanisms designed for them. On the highway, traffic continued as it always had, But within the system the calculus changed, because discretion now carried a documented cost when untethered from law. She observed the changes with measured distance, aware that reform was iterative and fragile, but also aware that precedent had been reinforced, not by anger, but by accuracy. The stop that began with lights and assumptions ended with findings and directives, a collapse not of individuals alone, but of a practice sustained by silence. And in that collapse, something durable took its place, a reminder written into policy and record that rights did not yield to convenience, and that accountability, once engaged, did not require spectacle to endure. The final order was issued weeks later, measured in tone and precise in scope, closing the inquiry not with celebration but with clarity, and it articulated what the process had established beyond dispute, that the stop on the highway was not an isolated lapse, but a manifestation of discretion untethered from constitutional restraint. It outlined corrective actions adopted and required, set benchmarks for compliance, and mandated ongoing review, ensuring that the response would not fade with attention but persist as obligation. She signed it without flourish, aware that permanence was built through records rather than rhetoric, and as the document circulated it carried with it a quiet finality that did not depend on public approval to endure. In the days that followed, she returned to her routine, presiding over cases that demanded the same discipline she had applied to her own experience, refusing to allow familiarity to dull vigilance. When attorneys cited the revised policies and arguments, she listened closely, testing whether the language had truly changed practice or merely polished it, because she knew reform was only real when it altered behavior rather than narrative. Outside the courthouse, the story traveled in fragments, simplified and reshaped, but inside the system its impact was exacting and concrete, measured by altered procedures, preserved footage, and a recalibrated understanding of authority. She did not seek to be recognized for what had occurred, and she did not correct those who misunderstood the scope of her role, because the point had never been who she was, but what the law required regardless of who stood before it. On a later afternoon, she drove that same stretch of highway again, not intentionally, but inevitably, the road an ordinary conduit between obligations, and as she passed the shoulder where it had begun she felt no surge of emotion, only a steady awareness of how easily the moment could have disappeared without consequence. She considered the countless stops that never reached a database threshold, never triggered verification, never paused authority long enough for reconsideration, and she understood that the work ahead remained vast and unfinished. Yet she also understood that something had shifted, not everywhere, not permanently, but enough to matter, because precedent had been reinforced and scrutiny normalized where silence once prevailed. In chambers later, she spoke to a group of clerks about the difference between power and restraint, explaining that the law functioned best when it constrained those entrusted with it, when it resisted convenience in favor of principle, when it treated calm as a right rather than a provocation. Her words were not lofty, and they did not linger theatrically, but they carried the weight of lived consequence, which mattered more. As the term progressed, data from oversight reviews reflected modest but meaningful changes, reductions in escalations without cause, improved documentation, earlier supervisory intervention, not victories to be announced but corrections to be sustained. She knew there would be backlash and fatigue, attempts to revert under pressure, and she prepared for that as well, because accountability was not an event but a posture. The memory of the cuffs never left her entirely, nor did it define her, existing instead as a reminder of why neutrality demanded effort and why rights required guardianship even, and especially, when the system insisted it was functioning as intended. When she ended her workday and stepped outside, the city moved around her as it always had, indifferent to process, unaware of the quiet recalibrations underway, and she welcomed that normalcy, because justice was not meant to be spectacle. The highway continued to carry drivers forward, lights flashing now and then as they always would, but written into policy and practice was a reaffirmation that authority was accountable and that dignity was not conditional. She had not raised her voice on the roadside, and she had not revealed her title to secure compliance. Instead, she had allowed the law to observe itself and to correct what it found wanting. That was the statement she left behind, not spoken aloud, but recorded where it would matter most, a standard set without shouting, a reminder that silence was not submission, and that justice, when applied with discipline, could still close the distance between what was promised and what was practiced.